Hey, I'm Ryan. I'm lucky to be able to spend some time today talking through one of my favorite weird old synths, the Technos Acxel. The Technos Acxel is really cool because it's an encapsulation of a lot of what was really great about instrument design in the 1980s. Specifically, in the 1980s, electronic instrument manufacturers started focusing less and less on using expressly analog technologies for their sound making. As digital technologies became cheaper and computing power became more powerful, all in all, more manufacturers relied on using digital sound generation, sampling, and digital control methods that meant really a designer could make any kind of instrument they wanted, both in terms of the sound generation and user interaction. The Acxel was designed by a Québécois company called Technos in the 1980s and was a culmination of a lot of the work that they did with resynthesis, which is a technique based on sampling incoming audio and using large additive oscillator banks in order to recreate sounds. This overcame a lot of the issues they saw with sampling, which we'll get into a little bit later. The Acxel itself is a two-piece instrument. One piece is called the grapher, which is the user interface for the device, which uses an array of over 2,000 LED embedded touch plates in order to control all of the tone shaping in the instrument. The other piece is called the solitary, which is a roughly mini fridge-sized processor where all of the instrument's I/O is located, as well as a pretty loud fan, which you can probably hear in the recording. So this is the Acxel's grapher. The grapher is the primary user interface on the Acxel and is the way that we manage the kind of intense number of resources that's required to perform additive synthesis, because the Acxel is, after all, primarily an additive synthesizer. One of its important purposes is to execute resynthesis, but we'll get to that a little bit later and focus on how we can build sounds with additive synthesis from the ground up. So the thing with additive synthesis is that it's largely based around using pretty enormous oscillator banks and a ton of amplifiers in order to build a sound harmonic by harmonic. So rather than starting with a harmonically rich sawtooth wave or a square wave and then filtering it, we instead use sine waves or other simple waveforms, combine them together at different frequencies in order to approximate more complex sounds. In the Acxel, what that means is that there are 32 oscillators per voice and 32 amplifiers per voice prior to a master amplifier and mixer, so that we can use this, again, enormous array of oscillators to construct more complex sounds. Of course, managing that much information is kind of complicated, but the Acxel came up with a pretty clever way to do it, which is by organizing all of the sound's really important parameters into spectra. There are 4 different spectra we can view on the Acxel at any given time. The first is the integer spectrum. The integer spectrum is a control for the frequency of each individual oscillator relative to one another. In this display, where we're viewing the integer spectrum, we can see 32 individual LED lines, which we can just kind of touch and scroll around to change the levels of. Basically, this determines which overtone each of the individual oscillators is tuned to. So whenever we have all of the oscillators set down here, we get just the fundamental tone, the pitch that we play on our MIDI controller. If we put everything up here, we would get just the 30-second partial, which is a few octaves higher than the fundamental, and everywhere in between. The next most important spectrum that the Acxel uses to organize all of these waves is the amplitude spectrum. This is the same kind of control. We have 32 lines that can be used to now control the loudness of each oscillator. So if we have, as is the default on the Acxel, only the first of these turned up, we'll hear a very simple sound. We'll hear a sine wave like this. And that's pretty cool. It's a good sounding sine wave, but much more interesting once we start dialing up the level of the other individual oscillators. You can think of the amplitude spectrum as being somewhat like the drawbars on a Hammond organ, where we have a bunch of preset pitches that all of these individual generators are tuned to, and we're just controlling how loud they are in stepped increments. This sounds pretty cool too whenever we start to edit the integer spectrum in real time, which again is the display on which we tune all of the individual oscillators. So let's just tinker with that for a second. Another important spectrum on the Axel is referred to as the beating spectrum, and it's the one that we locate furthest to the right here. The beating spectrum is a control for inharmonicity for each individual oscillator. So where we get these kind of coarse changes in frequency in the integer spectrum, that is, these changes that jump from one partial to the next, the beating spectrum is a more continuous control that gives us the ability to move the tuning all the way up to the next partial or all the way down to the next lowest partial. Again, this is a spectrum, so it gives us a display for all of the individual oscillators at once, meaning that we can, at one time, sweep through and detune all of these individual oscillators. So let's tinker with that. If we go back to the integer spectrum and tune all of our oscillators in each voice to the same frequency, I'll just choose the third partial here, and then start to tinker around with the beating spectrum, we'll get a kind of detuned, swarmy sine wave sort of thing. Cool. The last spectrum that's available to us is the phase spectrum. Basically what this does is offset the phase of each of our oscillators up to almost 360 degrees. I think the maximum's like 348 degrees. So basically, whenever all of these oscillators get summed together, we can use phase offset in the summing process in order to create subtle deviations in the timbre. At the end of the day, this is pretty subtle, but it's awesome that they included it. I wonder if they thought it was going to be a little bit more profound than it actually is, but let's see if we can hear what that's like. I'm going to dial up a more complex sound just by going into our beating spectrum, or our integer spectrum, kind of settle our beating spectrum back to have no inharmonicity. Make sure we're hearing everything in the amplitude spectrum. And now we'll look back at our phase spectrum. So here's everything with phase at 0 degrees. So all of the sine waves are starting their cycle at a 0 crossing. Again, changing the phase of the individual oscillators is super subtle. I don't even know if I really hear that much of a difference in the sound, but supposedly it's a thing that it does. That more or less covers the idea of a spectrum. Again, just to review, a spectrum in the Axel is a simultaneous display of a single parameter for all of the oscillators internal to a voice. Again, we have a spectrum for the integer multiplier for the tuning, which is basically the overtone that each oscillator is tuned to. For the beating, which is the amount of inharmonicity or deviation from the actual tuning of the overtone. The amplitude for each individual oscillator, which is just the loudness of each one, and the phase, so just a phase displacement, so things can get a little bit out of phase and some in a slightly different way to get slightly different wave shapes at the end. Should say that together, the oscillator, the amplifier, and a couple of envelope generators for each of these individual units is generally referred to as a synthesis cell, specifically an intelligent synthesis cell, or ISC. We'll get into what's up with those envelopes and cells a little bit later after we've talked more about how the envelopes themselves work. Seemed a good idea to mention it at this point, though. So now let's get something just quickly with an interesting overtone structure put together, and we can start talking about envelopes. That seems like it's probably about as good as anything for the sake of getting into envelopes, so let's roll with it. So the Axel has a ton of envelopes available for each voice. Let's talk first about a few of the envelopes that affect the voice on a global level. That is the envelopes that affect the kind of high-level parameters of each voice. These envelopes can be edited by pages selected over here where it says conveniently envelope. The most obvious envelope in this synthesizer, like any other, is the volume envelope, so let's take a look at that first. The default envelope on the Axel is a falling wave, which is a sensible enough thing. It has a hard attack and constant decay. Right now I have this envelope set to be about 9 seconds long, so we can hear that here. It's the same envelope we've been using for everything so far. If we want to change the time base of the envelope, that is, if we want to change its total duration, we have to look at this vacuum fluorescent display to the duration field, and then we navigate to the duration field using these display navigation arrows. So let's go ahead and change the duration. Cool. And now we can use the keypad to dial in specific values. So let's change from this 9-second envelope to a 1-second envelope. And we'll hear that. Awesome. It's a shorter envelope than it was a second ago. Great. Let's go and make that a bit longer again. 32 seconds is maybe a little bit overkill. 12 seconds seems like a reasonable timeline. Anyway, so like with the spectra that we discussed earlier, the envelope is edited just using this touch plate display. So you can literally come in and draw any envelope shape you want. So again, the default envelope shape is a constant decay, but we can draw any envelope shape that we want. So let's make something that swells in over time and then decays. As simple as this. Or we could create an envelope that has the illusion of multiple attacks simply by drawing a shape with multiple attacks. So basically, the volume envelope can be any shape with up to 64 breakpoints that can all be set to any individual level. You can get really particular about tuning individual stages to do different things. These envelopes can also be up to 32 seconds long, so you can really make something that evolves over time along a very particular defined trajectory, which is pretty sweet. Yeah, so the other kind of cool thing to note about this envelope is it doesn't have a traditional hold or sustain stage the way we get with normal ADSRs or ASRs and on. Instead, you can define any point along this kind of 64 breakpoint graph as being a hold stage. And you can do that by using the alpha line. The alpha line is this extra line of touch plates just above the matrix display that has a bunch of letters up above it, hence the name alpha line. This is the kind of keyboard you use whenever you name programs on the synthesizer, but in envelope view, it's how we edit our hold stage. So the default you can see is for the hold stage to be the first one. That's why this letter A is selected right now, because A is the default hold stage. So whenever I press a key, the default is for it to stay at that first stage as long as I hold the key, and then to advance through the rest of the envelope afterward. So let's see if that's true. And now I'm going to release. So yeah, it did exactly what we expected it would do. That said, we can define any other stage to be the hold stage as well. So right now I've set stage I to be my hold stage. So the envelope, as long as I'm holding the key, will advance through these stages until it reaches I. We'll hold there until I release, and then we'll advance through the rest. So again, let's try it out and see if that's true. So it's still true. How awesome is that? I'm going to go ahead and make our envelope a bit shorter again so that we can demonstrate one of the other really cool features about this envelope. So I've just shortened it to be 2 seconds rather than the 12 seconds we were just listening to. This kind of gnarly, complex shape becomes a lot weirder in this context. Makes that kind of sound. The really cool thing about this envelope is that not only can we define any hold stage, we can define any hold region. This is pretty different from most other envelopes in that suddenly we have the ability to define a hold stage that isn't necessarily just a static level, but a series of changing levels. So let's see what happens whenever we set our hold region or our loop region to be A through I. All I had to do was press A and suddenly the region between A and I is selected. So now, as long as I hold the key, it'll repeat this section over and over again until I release, and then we'll advance through the rest of the envelope. And just to make that a little more apparent, I'm going to make a more distinct shape here at the end. So let's see. Also pretty cool. At even shorter envelope lengths, this gets really crazy. So we're now down to a 0.1 second envelope. And that's the general idea of how the Axel's envelopes work. These crazy 64-point graphs that you can create any shape you want, and you can tell it to arbitrarily loop any region you want as you hold a key. Pretty nuts. So let's dial in a more reasonable amplitude envelope, and then we can start to look at some of the other envelopes that are afforded to us on a global per voice level. So I'm going to duck in and grab this, and we'll go with like a 3-second envelope. I'm going to make it where our first stage is the hold stage again. And I'm going to dial back in that kind of decaying envelope shape. So we're back to relatively normal. Sweet, it's an envelope again. So there are 3 other envelopes that we have access to here. Let's switch to the next one, which is called FC. FC is a funky digital filter, which basically operates simply by changing the volume of a bunch of these things at slightly different levels as you go. You can do the same sorts of things defining the envelope shape here. And you can actually change the envelope type as well, which is pretty crazy. If we go a couple pages back in the display, we have the ability to switch from low pass to high pass to bandpass shapes. And then we also have the ability to make our own filter type using this programmable filter and kind of drawing the response curve we want. We'll try that in a second after kind of investigating how some of the more normal curve shapes work. So we're back to low pass now at 18 decibel per octave slope. If memory serves, yeah, you can create any kind of arbitrary number of decibels per octave up to the point where it's pretty dang steep. It tops out at 42 decibels per octave, but we can make something much gentler as well. It goes all the way down to 6 decibels per octave. So you really have a pretty fine level of control over the overall response. So let's hear what like a 16 decibel per octave filter is like. Go back to our envelope page and hear our sound with the envelope all the way open the whole time. Cool, does what you'd think. And now let's draw in a filter envelope. Adjust our volume envelope so it remains a little bit louder so that the filter has a little bit more to dig into. The effect's pretty subtle, but you can hear this kind of growliness, this thing that it's starting to do because we have this funky envelope applied. That same thing with a bandpass envelope is going to be similar but funky. Pretty rad. And now let's try it for the heck of it with our programmable shape. No idea what this is going to turn out like. actually sounds pretty cool. I like it. So let's go back to a more neutral shape again and open this envelope up all the way so that we no longer hear the effects of that envelope anymore. Let's dive over into the color envelope next. The color envelope is a control for yet another filter, this time an analog low-pass filter that's at the end of the signal chain for every voice. So this is pretty similar, does analog low-pass filtering, so pretty easy to get it dialed in. Let's hear what this sounds like. So, an analog low-pass filter. Maybe one of the most interesting of the voice level envelopes is this last one though, the FM envelope. Because yeah, this thing does FM on top of all the other crazy stuff it does. It's 2-operator FM essentially, using a tunable modulator that always operates at a specific ratio relative to the carrier. And we can define the index up here, again, using our numeric display, our numeric keypad, or the display controls. So let's dial in a higher index. So index is 8 right now. And we'll dial in a higher ratio so that we can hear what's going on. So the index control here is kind of the maximum amount of modulation we get from the FM. Instead of defining the absolute index here, we use the envelope to define where the index is at every given moment within the range that we define with the index control itself. So if the envelope was set to nothing, then there'd be no FM. Or we can dial in dynamic FM shapes like this. Let's go back to our amplitude spectrum and hear that without all the extra overtones, just to see what the pure FM sound itself is like. Go up to a higher index. Classic crunchy 2-operator FM bell kind of sounds. We can also dial in any amount of inharmonicity we want, any ratio we want. The other really cool thing is that we can use ratios well below 1 in order to get super gnarly sounds. And this is what that's like. If we bring back in some of the overtones with the amplitude spectrum, this gets absolutely wild. So these are on the edges of some of the weirder sounds that the Acxel can make outside of its kind of dynamic additive synthesis capabilities. Really, so far we've only touched the surface of the additive synthesis stuff in favor of looking at these envelopes. Now that we've looked at all of the voice level envelopes and seen what possibilities they offer, let's dig into all the things we can do inside of a voice to add more modulation and see what role envelopes play there. First, gonna go ahead and even out all of this gnarly FM stuff. And we're back to a relatively normal Axel sound again. So far, everything we've been doing has been in the realm of what Technos calls fixed additive synthesis. This process of going into our spectra, defining what overtones we want to hear, how much inharmonicity they have, how loud they are, what their phase is relative to each other, and then doing some pretty simple voice level stuff in terms of filtering and FM and adding a little bit of color to the sound. But that doesn't tap very deeply into this concept that Technos called the ISC, the Intelligent Synthesis Cell. As a reminder, the intelligent synthesis cell, it contains a single oscillator, a single amplifier, and then an envelope for each of those things. There are 32 of these cells per voice, and that's why we have the ability to control the pitch and volume of these 32 oscillators independently. Each one is kind of contained in its own little micro voice within the total voice, and all 32 of them per voice come together to make these more complex sounds. So what I'm saying basically is that in addition to these voice level envelopes, of which we get 4, we also have an envelope for each oscillator's pitch and each oscillator's amplitude, meaning that there are an extra 64 envelopes per voice that we haven't even looked at yet. So let's go to the part of the grapher called ISC and see what happens there. First, we'll go to Isc Amp. Whenever we go to this page, the whole thing's going to light up red. And the reason is that we're operating still in fixed additive synthesis mode. If you look at the mode field on the display, you'll see it says FAS. If we use the display navigation arrows to go upward, then it switches us into DAS, or dynamic additive synthesis mode. In this mode, we have access to all of these envelopes for the amplitude again. So within a voice, the thing that was shaped by this larger voice level volume envelope, we can start to animate the levels of individual cells. So the way that we select which cell we're editing has to do with this line below the matrix display, which we haven't really discussed yet. Again, this line up here is called the alpha line. We use that to define looping regions for envelopes and hold regions. But the numera line below is basically a display of which ISC envelopes we're editing at any given time. Right now we see that 1 is flashing, meaning that that is the one that we're actually viewing. But by pressing these, we can edit any number that we want all simultaneously. So let's change the level of the first 16 cells independently of the second set of 16 cells. All I have to do is scoot my finger along the bottom here to select all of the cells that I want to edit and draw a volume envelope. So before changing anything, this is what our sound is like, just with a regular pitch. That same buzzy, wonky Axel sound that we've been using this whole time so far. So let's change the level of all of these cells. you can see that the LEDs lag a little bit because we're actually editing a lot of information right now. It's not the same as when we're editing this per voice volume envelope where really we're only updating 8 envelopes at once because we're, again, this is an 8 voice instrument. Whenever we do this, we're editing a ton of envelopes all at once, so it takes a second sometimes for it to catch up to where your finger is. But let's listen to the difference now. You can hear this is a sound that has a lot of high energy, high frequency energy throughout, but low frequency energy that comes and goes with the shape of this envelope. That's because in our integer spectrum, we have it set up so that the cells gradually get higher and higher pitched. You can make something even more linear and hear the effects again. It's interesting because it's an effect not dissimilar to filtering, but it gives us a lot more complex control over how the sound evolves over time. So let's go wild for a second, kind of applying different envelope shapes to different parts of the sound. Like for instance, let's take those top 16 now and change what they're doing. So we've drawn now a shape that's pretty different from the first 16 cells. Let's hear what that sound is like overall. So we have this sound that now has a bunch of high partials, which have this kind of pinging envelope going on, this repeating shape, and low partials, which swell in and out as time goes on. Pretty cool that we're able to do that. I'm going to switch to a slightly simpler shape so that we can look at some other envelopes and what they do. Sweet. So the next ISC envelope that we'll want to look at is the frequency envelope. Again, whenever we switch to this display, it appears pretty boring and we can't actually edit anything because, again, we're in fixed additive synthesis mode regarding the pitch. There are 2 dynamic additive synthesis modes regarding pitch, so let's take a look at both of those. The first is called DASI. What DASI means is dynamic additive synthesis with integers. So we have the ability, like with the amplitude, to apply individual envelopes to each cell if we want, but they impact the integer value. So basically, we can create envelopes that perform this sort of integer changing function for us, where a sound has these kind of harmonic arpeggios, which is pretty cool. So let's set that up and hear what it's like. I'm still editing the top 16 partials here. So let's go back to editing the lower ones. Since they are tuned generally lower, they're going to have partials that have closer pitch values and generally have larger jumps between pitch for the partials. So the effect will be a little bit more profound there. So let's just draw a shape and see what happens. So you can hear that the pitch is kind of jumping up and down according to the shape of this envelope. Let's go back into our integer display and tune everything generally a little bit lower and start drawing more shapes for more cells. So let's leave the first group of cells with that envelope that we just drew, but we'll change these to do something a little bit different. We'll change these ones to do something different still. Then we'll do it one more sweep, being pretty haphazard about which ones are selected, and we'll give them something else still. And let's hear what this sound is like. I really have no idea what's going to happen. Pretty cool. So this results in pitch modulations that conform to the harmonic series. Generally, this will result in pretty gentle sounds that seem like they have this jumpy filtering characteristic going on. If we start to add in more inharmonicity in the beating spectrum, it gets a little bit funkier. And similarly, if we change the tuning in the integer spectrum, it gets a little bit funkier. But again, all in all, it's a pretty, what most people would call musical effect, in that the sounds conform to harmonic intervals relative to one another. I'm going to go back to our beating spectrum and even everything out so it's not very inharmonic. And then we can look at the next dynamic additive synthesis type, which is dynamic additive synthesis with pitch, which actually impacts the beating spectrum. So now instead of modulating entire integer values, we have more fine deviations in pitch. And this to me is where some of the really cool additive synthesis sounds come from, because this type of modulation has no regard for remaining confined to the harmonic series. So you can get a huge range of weird inharmonic sounds. Whenever we switched modes, it actually kept all the same envelope shapes we used, so we can just listen to this and see what it's like. Especially if we move to using longer envelopes, this can do some really, really cool stuff. So let's go back here. Switch to a longer envelope duration. We'll do just a little over 13 seconds. And see how things unfold. So let's switch to using a longer envelope for the pitch so that we can hear how some of these sounds might unfold over time if we give them a little bit more room to breathe. So I'm going to switch to an envelope 12 seconds long. That should give us a little bit more time to kind of hear all these modulations unfolding. This, to me, is where the Axel really excels, pardon the pun. These long, evolving sounds where you really do have time to hear these fluctuations in loudness and in pitch. Let's go in and change some of our amplitude settings as well, just so we can let those kind of play into this longer modulation scheme. Again, I'm not being terribly discerning about which ones I'm editing. We're just going to see if happenstance gets us to a cool sound, which more often than not it does. In settings like these, the first parameters we discussed, things like the integer spectrum, the amplitude spectrum, the beating spectrum, can all still have very profound effects. Let's go back to the integer spectrum for the same sound, same envelopes, and just retune things and hear how different things are. Just for the fun of it, let's try that same thing with a little bit of FM applied. To see what that does for us. We'll start with a relatively high ratio. And now let's try things out again with a really low ratio, below 1, and see what happens. Pretty insane. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the FM back down and get back to our nice animated sounds. And look at some of the other possibilities afforded to us in the ISC menu. There's a lot of stuff in here that isn't fully implemented, what we're about to talk out being one of those things, which leads you to think that the Axel was never really finished. It's fully capable of doing a ton of different stuff, but every once in a while you run into a brick wall where there's a feature in the manual that's not really described fully, and then you realize that, at least in whatever version of the operating system you're running, that thing just doesn't exist or wasn't a completed feature. So the feature we're looking at now is the actual wave shape for each of the individual oscillators in each cell. As it turns out, we can really only define this globally. So every cell in every voice has to use the same wave shape. But we still have the ability to create a bunch of really gnarly sounds this way. So far, we've been using this sine shape for everything, but there are actually others available. So that sound we've been using could be really different if it had a different shape as the basis. A square wave, for instance. We can even in this context use completely programmable shapes, which tends to get pretty noisy, but it's still a pretty cool feature. We can literally draw our own wave shape. Pretty cool all in all. But as you've seen, it took us this much time to make even just one sound. So despite the fact that the Axel has a pretty clever user interface and makes it pretty easy to get to all the parameters that we'd want to edit for additive synthesis, even this kind of complex, evolving additive synthesis, it still takes a little bit of time, isn't the most intuitive thing in the world, and doesn't feel like the most musical thing in the world whenever you're just scrolling around editing LEDs. As cool as it may be, not the kind of thing that you're really going to dial up new sounds in performance. So that brings us back to one of the primary features of the Axel, which is called Axel Ization. What Axel Ization is their own form of resynthesis. Basically, we have the ability to record a sound into a short buffer, up to 4 seconds long. And then the Axel does some pretty crazy magical things for having been built in the late 1980s. It uses a kind of primitive artificial intelligence in order to analyze the sound, determine which overtones are most prominent, how those overtones move in pitch over time, how they change in volume over time, and then it takes all the most pertinent data that it can identify and assigns it to all of the individual synthesis cells. Often for recreating sampled sound, that requires way more than the 32 oscillators and amplifiers we have per voice in this kind of from-scratch additive synthesis mode. So it basically has the ability to take resources from multiple voices and join them together into one mega voice that uses as many cells as it thinks that it needs in order to do things. This particular Axel is a fairly small configuration. It was the standard configuration whenever they were available, which is basically 8 voices with 32 cells each for a total of 256 cells, which means that in its Axel Ization features, it can't use any more than 256 individual oscillators and amplifiers to create a single sound. And when it does need that many sounds, it suddenly is monophonic rather than being 8 voices like we've seen so far. You could actually expand the system with up to 4 of these large voice cards, which are called SYN cards, so that you could have access to over 1,000 simultaneous partials. And seldom would a sound really need that many partials in order to be effectively recreated. It just made it such that you could have greater polyphony when you're creating these more complex sounds. The Axel came with a number of sound library disks on floppies. We have some copies of the original disks here, so we can see what some of these Axelized sounds were like. This is essentially how presets were delivered with this instrument and was meant to be a way to demonstrate the instrument's power. So let's load one of these disks and see what's on it. Okay. Okay. We're now loading a new timbre. And we now have access to the first timbre on Axel's Disc 3. The third program disc was primarily meant to recreate acoustic instruments. If you're interested to see every preset that these discs had, we filmed a couple videos a few years ago. We can link to those in the description so that you can hear what some of these presets were like, because some of them are pretty wonky. But we'll just go through a few here so you can get the general idea of what the sound of Axel Ization is like. So again, this preset's called Harp. I think it's one of the really cool ones. So we get this nice kind of goofy Harp Glissando sound as the first preset on the disc that's primarily acoustic instrument Axel Izations. It sounds just wonky. And again, I'd like to stress this sound is not sample-based at all. This sound is based on recreating a sampled sound using all of the internal synthesis facilities. So we can actually go to the integer spectrum and the beating spectrum and all of these envelopes and see what it is that the Axel's internal computer thought was the most efficient way to recreate these sounds. And the results are just stunningly complex. Way more complex than we could ever create by hand, obviously. So this kind of begs the question of, like, why did they do this? Because again, this, despite being cool, is not the most convincing harp sound in the universe. The reason is because this approach solved what Technos called the Tandem Problem. The Tandem Problem being this issue with samplers where in order to change the pitch of a pre-recorded sample, you actually have to change the playback speed of the sample. So in order to get a keyboard's worth of sampled sounds, this harp sound for instance, the keys that were gradually higher in pitch would actually have shorter and shorter durations. And the keys that got lower in pitch from the recorded original pitch would be longer and longer. So that there's this inherent tandem coupling of duration and pitch, which Technos found unfavorable, because it actually gets you further from being able to make an effective recreation of the characteristics of the sound. With the Axel, since everything is resynthesized, that is, it's based on this kind of weird statistical model of how long it takes for certain overtones to decay and change in pitch. That time information and that pitch and overtone information can be applied to any fundamental pitch. So no matter what pitch we play on the keyboard, the sound that plays back is exactly the same length. I'll illustrate that by playing two keys at once. They end at exactly the same time. One of the other really cool implications is that this means that we can alter the time scale of the resynthesized sound without affecting the pitch. One of the really cool ways to do that, and this can be applied to any sound in the Axel, is using the compander, which is accessible via option 1 down in the bottom left corner. We get this nice goofy plus-minus display that basically allows us to compress or expand all of the envelope's durations at the same time. So we can expand by a factor here of up to 2 times the original duration. Or we can make the sound half as long as the original duration. All in real time. Up to the point where we have a sound that is very much not harp-like, and we encounter all these weird digital artifacts that were just inevitable. Anyway, let's look at a couple of the other sounds they included just to see what they're like. Next is the Hendrix sound. Wild guess what that's going to be like. This one takes actually a rather large number of resources. So it's probably going to be just monophonic because it's using so many cells. is sick. And yeah, just strictly monophonic, but they're goofy electric guitar sound. And let's look at maybe one or two more. Banjo, Zuki, Metal FM, Duck. Wind Chimes is another awesome one. Sweet. We now have access to our awesome wind chime sound. Excellent wind chimes, right? Let's load Wind Chimes 2. It's a bit longer one. Not necessarily the most convincing wind chimes, but it's really interesting to hear what this does with sounds as complex as a bunch of wind chimes chiming around, a bunch of weird little inharmonic tubes clanging against each other, and how it tries to translate that based on the resources it has into a musically viable sound, or at least what Technos thought was a musically viable sound. So now with the help of my handy-dandy SM57, we're going to try to Axelize a real-life sound. The process of getting all the levels right is a little bit funky, so we might have to edit some junk out, but bear with us. Yeah, so all we have to do is go to the Axelizer menu here and tell it that we want to start recording, and it'll automatically detect when to start recording based on the incoming volume. So I'm just going to press 0 to record and go for it. Technos Acxel Resynthesizer. Yes, we have an optimal recording level. This is awesome. Usually I don't get it to work that quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and press 1 to start the analysis process. And then we're going to let it do its thing. So basically what's happening now is it's going to take multiple passes through that little 4-second buffer that we just recorded of me saying Technos Acxel Resynthesizer. And it's gonna basically do this kind of FFT-like process where it goes through and determines piece by piece what all the most important pitches are and what all the most important changes in loudness and pitch are. And then it's gonna start assigning all of those values to the internal synthesis engine. So right now it's still doing the analysis. It'll switch over to moving into the actual synthesis here in just a second. It is now generating our Isc envelopes, which is a good sign. We're going to see it fill up this display here with a bunch of gibberish characters. I have no idea if the actual letters that it puts up there are of any significance, but they are all the same every time, so probably they mean something that I just don't understand. Okay, it's generated all the envelopes and it's actually consolidating all the information into a new timbre now. So soon. Yes, okay, so yeah, now we are fully axelized. So let's just take a look at things. This is our integer spectrum, or at least the integer spectrum for the first group of voices, beating spectrum, all that cool stuff that we saw before. Let's hear what it sounds like.
Technos Acxel Resynthesizer.
Technos Acxel Resynthesizer.
Technos Acxel Resynthesizer.
Technos Acxel Resynthesizer.
That's around where the pitch of my voice was, I think. So something like this.
Technos Acxel Technos Acxel Technos
Whoa. So it apparently used enough ISCs that it's strictly monophonic. It was a complex enough sound that it had to use literally all of this thing's resources in order to recreate it. Yeah, for the sake of getting a weird little chipmunk voice. Pretty sick. So we can go back and do some of that kind of gnarly stuff that we did to the synthesized sounds using an Axelized sound now. So we'll just do the time stretching compander thing first.
Technos Acxel Resynthesizer.
That's pretty cool already. But what we didn't do with the harp sound earlier is, actually dig into the inside of the sound and start screwing with the way sounds evolve over time and the level of different partials relative to one another. One of the easiest ways to really get screwy very fast is to go to the integer spectrum and change the actual integers that it's using for the pitch of all of the overtones in my voice. So let's hear that. Pretty cool. Let's go to our amplitude spectrum and screw up some envelopes, or amplitude Isc, I guess. And let's go into the frequency Isc and start screwing with some pitches. And we'll see how much this sound is like the actual thing that went in. Whoa, that's pretty nuts already. Let's see about lengthening the envelopes. So this is the result of really time stretching things beyond the compander and in the actual Isc envelopes themselves. Stuff gets just absolutely wild. If we want to get it really gnarly and let's just completely destroy this thing, let's add some FM again. We're going to go to a super high index because of course we want a super high index. And we'll start with a relatively high ratio. Let's do a funky ratio so we don't risk it sounding pretty. And yeah, let's hear it. So those are some of the kind of gnarly sounds you can get into by first starting with a relatively normal sound that's not super interesting by itself. Really, it's not that much different from just sampling something. But you can really dig into it and from the inside out change the way the sound works entirely so that you're using the dynamic profile of a real sound but really screwing up the internal frequency information, or vice versa. You could even go in and change the waveform that's used to resynthesize. You can add frequency modulation, you can filter it, and all kinds of crazy sounds are waiting there. The possibilities are pretty endless, and it gets super noisy super fast. So yeah, that's the Technos Acxel. Super weird synthesizer, super weird sounds, and a super weird way of interacting with the sounds. Again, I think that's one of the coolest things about synths from the 1980s that's maybe exemplified better in this than in anything else. It came out of this time where instrument designers really had the freedom and felt empowered to make whatever kind of wacky instrument they wanted. This is a super rare thing, and I feel honored to have the opportunity to play it and hope you found something cool and inspiring that you can use in your own music.